Can a lens be magical? The XF 35mm F1.4 from Fujifilm was one of their first lenses to be released when the X-mount system was introduced, and it's still one of the most coveted lenses in their lineup. Why is that though? Well, to find out why this piece of glass is still one of the most recommended products in the Fuji lineup, I decided to pick it up for myself and put it through its paces. To really see how this lens performs nearly 9 years after its release, I decided to make it my daily driver for the better part of 3 weeks as I traveled across India. If you've watched a fair amount of videos on this channel, you know by now that the 50mm equivalent focal length is just not something I enjoy that much. It doesn't seem wide enough to tell a story, and personally I don't think it's tight enough to show intimacy, but again, that's my preference. However, this lens, this 35mm f1.4 had so much of a lore behind it, I just had to make it my daily driver to really test it out and give it a fair shot. So I packed it, made it my go-to with the X Pro 3, and I left my trusted 23mm f2.0 at home. What struck me immediately about this 35mm lens was just how light it was. At a little over 180 grams, when I put it on my camera, it didn't significantly shift that center of gravity too far forward, which made it an enjoyable experience to use in the streets. Counter to this, the Mitakon 35mm f0.95. I did a review on this and you can find it in the description. Well, that thing lets you know every single time it's on your camera. I mean, it shifts the center of gravity so far forward, it's nearly comical. Now, the Fuji lens is missing a few key features, like a modern autofocus system, weather sealing, a manual clutch, and adding those would probably add to the size and weight of this thing, but despite all that, it is still enjoyable. I still appreciate the fact that it's such a light and easy lens to use when pairing it with a modern Fuji camera. Armed with my new custom recipes, which you guys can find in the description below, I hit the streets with the 35mm f1.4, and even though I don't shoot with this equivalent focal length much, it was hard to ignore the results that were being rendered by this piece of glass. Whether I shot at f1.4 or higher, the center was crisp, but there's no denying that this is a sharp lens. And when you went north of f2.8, the corners followed suit and they had that similar sharpness. More importantly though, the images had this unique pop and depth to them. It was strange in a great way. And the only other lens that I can think of off the top of my head would be the 56mm f1.2. And there's some other lenses that replicate this to a lesser degree, but it just had a little bit more of this 3D effect than the 35mm f2 lens from Fujifilm. It took me the better part of a day to get acclimated to this 35mm f1.4 and accept the fact that I don't have my 23mm f2 with me, but any sense of longing was quickly mitigated from a snapshot with this lens. The dance between color and contrast on this lens is pure synchronicity. It isn't as punchy with the contrast as the 35mm f2 if you're asking me, but in a good way. It just seems like there's more resolution here, a bit more balance. And when I say resolution, I don't mean megapixel, I mean just resolution, right? It just feels like it's a bit more at peace. There were many nights where I would come back and review the images and I just felt so happy with how the images were coming out of the camera. JPEGs. I'm just looking at the JPEGs right here, where when you have the right body, the right settings, the right lens, and you really compose your image, you're getting a fantastic result out of camera. And this is a lens that allows you to do that more times than not. All in all, it just felt really harmonious, and it's a magical feeling to have as a photographer, especially when you're, well, 8,000 miles away from home. Now, how does this lens compare to other 35mm lenses available for the Fuji X-mount? Well, I had the pleasure of owning the 35mm f2 from Fujifilm, as well as the Mitakon 35mm f0.95, and I got to test the XC 35mm f2, which is really the XF but plastic and no weather sealing. Anyways, I got to play around with a lot of these lenses, and let me tell you, when you use the 35mm f1.4, comparing it against those, well, it really seemed to underscore the value of this f1.4 lens. Optically speaking, the f1.4 just had a look I preferred over the 35mm f2 from Fujifilm. And I do have to be careful when I communicate this because, well, it could be largely preferential, and if you're not comparing them against each other, you might not even notice the difference. But when you do see it, well, it's hard to not see it again. And another thing I should say, the f1.4 lens can focus a bit closer than the 35mm f2, but I will say it just doesn't produce as good results up close. So it's something that I didn't find myself doing quite often on this trip. More importantly though, the f1.4, as the name would suggest, allows you to get over a stop more light capturing ability than the f2 lens, and that can be a considerable difference. It really depends on the environment that you find yourself in. But when you're looking at the ability to have this extra stop or more really of light gathering ability, well, it did come in handy more times than not. With all that said, between the f1.4 and the f2 35mm from Fujifilm, there is a clear and noticeable difference in optical quality with the f1.4. How much of a gap will ultimately be based on your shooting environment and really what you capture as a subject. With respect to the Mitakon 35mm, well, I'll try to keep this brief. That's really a character lens. You're buying that to shoot really wide open, if not at f0.95. There's no autofocus there, and even for video, you're looking to get this unique shot that's really unique to that lens. It's not something that's really competing with the 35mm f1.4 or even the f2 for that matter. It's something that delivers a niche result that many people might find useful for the work that they're creating. The Mitakon simply isn't as practical as the f1.4 or the f2 from Fujifilm, and it doesn't try to be. It's looking to give a unique result, and when you're looking at optical quality, no, it's not going to be as good as this f1.4 lens. But again, that is an option for a specific result, and really you should weigh it against what you're trying to capture. And I said it before, I'll say it again, the Mitakon is a bloody heavy lens, and you know every single time you're using it. If we're looking at the 35mm f1.4, f2, and Mitakon f0.95, the 1.4 very clearly edges out the other two with respect to the end result. And the order in which I mentioned them is personally exactly how I'd rank them. However, that doesn't mean that the f1.4 isn't without flaws. Having used this as my daily driver for a pretty intensive project, well, the opportunities for improvement really began to show through. In just about any review, people are going to mention the autofocus on this lens as a potential weak point. But is it really that bad? Here's the thing, on modern Fujifilm cameras using the X-Trans4 sensor, you're gonna get very snappy autofocus when it's relatively static subjects. I didn't notice any significant hunting in most shooting environments. I would bring up the camera, line up my composition, it would lock onto the subject and allow me to snap the picture. The age of this camera really began to show through when you moved into more dynamic environments. What was interesting is that when I was using my X Pro 3 and looking through the viewfinder or looking at the LCD when I had that opportunity, it would have an outline, a box around a face or the subject that it acquired focus, but you could see the lens trying to catch up. It wasn't as fast as the system itself. The camera knew, but the lens was always 1 or 2 steps behind. Add to this, the lens makes a clear noise when it's trying to acquire focus. And let's be honest, it's not gonna be annoying for most people. In most environments, the photographer might be the only one that hears it. But I found myself in one particular situation where I was in a recording booth trying to shoot my subject, and this lens, well, it was a non-starter. We just couldn't use it because the microphones were picking it up, and really it was a bit distracting for our subject. With all that said, are these deal breakers for potential buyers? Maybe not. These are definitely pain points, but you have to weigh them against the end result, and more often than not, the juice was worth the squeeze. There is one other drawback to this lens, and that's the lack of weather resistance. This lens came out at a time where that feature may not have been much of a priority, and if we dive into microeconomics, well, the marginal benefit to be had by investing the research and resources into including that feature at that time may not have been worth the marginal cost. However, I sit here in 2020 with this lens and I can't help but think if it had a proper successor that had weather resistance built in, how much more of an enjoyable experience it could be. While I didn't get caught up in any torrential downpour while I was in India, there was plenty of dust to go around. And believe me, my X Pro 3 reminds me of that every single day with its exposure dial. Just not quite like the day I got it. And while the 35mm f1.4 doesn't have any hiccups, it doesn't have any issues right now, I can't help but feel a little worried for the future trips to come, even if they are a bit ways away. And if I can take a minute to make a plea to anyone at Fujifilm that's absorbing this content, please do consider greenlighting the production of a Mark II version of this lens and even a few other premium lenses in your lineup. Imagine releasing a Mark II version of this lens, the 35mm F1.4, that has a focus clutch, a distance scale, a modern focusing system, and weather resistance. What a product that would be. And yes, Fujifilm, you might be wondering and worried that it would cannibalize sales of the current version as people wait for the new version, but I challenge you to mitigate that by releasing another lens in between or another camera product, and trust that your community will support you in the long run. Anyways, I digress. Let's get back to the review. After 3 weeks of using this overseas as my daily driver, where have I landed? I believe the 35mm F1.4 should be considered your first option if you're a fan of the 50mm focal length. For about $200 more than the 35mm F2, you're gonna get a product that I believe will produce better images more times than not. And despite its 52mm filter size, this thing is incredibly light and very easy to wield. And check this out, it even includes this beautiful hood to be used with it as well. Again, top notch. The only reason in my eyes you would consider another option, and that being really the 35mm F2, is if you needed weather resistance or you shoot in really dynamic environments and continuous autofocus is a critical feature to your work. That being said, weigh your expectations against the end result. I went into this as someone that wasn't really a fan of the 50mm focal length, and well, this lens made me more of a fan. I didn't mind adjusting how I shot to get more shots out of this lens. Just the way it rendered, it made for something that was a pleasing workflow. When you're mindful of the lighting, the composition, the way the shadows are falling, the 35mm F1.4 really is a magical lens. Leaning on its strengths while pivoting around its drawbacks is not an incredibly difficult thing to do, and something that rewards you with some great images. It's a product that's a must-have for some and a must-try for many. Does it crack the top 3 Fujifilm lenses for me? No. Does it crack the top 5? Possibly. And I say that with the utmost respect. This lens took a focal length that I didn't enjoy and made it enjoyable. And really, that's the biggest compliment I can give. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review, but more importantly, I'd love to hear what you guys think. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below and let's continue the conversation there. Again, my name's Gajan. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.